In the gray haze of Milltown, a small industrial town nestled in the Rust Belt of 1970s America, the steel factory stood like a hulking beast, its smokestacks coughing black plumes into the sky. The town thrived on the factory's pulse, its clanging machinery, the hum of molten metal, the rhythm of men's boots on concrete. For most, it was a place of pride, a symbol of honest labor. But for Marcus Reed, a 24-year-old black man who had arrived 6 months ago, it was a gauntlet of hostility he navigated daily. Marcus was the only black worker on the factory floor. His presence was a quiet anomaly in a town where faces like his were rarely seen outside the rundown East Side, where black families had been relegated for decades. He'd come from Chicago, chasing a job after his father's death left his family scraping by. The factory paid well, better than anything he'd found back home, but the cost was steeper than he'd imagined. From his first day, the other workers, mostly white, mostly born and bred in Milltown, made it clear he didn't belong. It started with stares, cold and unyielding, as he clocked in. Then came the whispers, just loud enough for him to hear. "Who let him in here? He's gonna mess something up, you watch." The foreman, a barrel-chested man named Hank with a perpetual scowl, assigned Marcus the dirtiest jobs, cleaning slag from the furnaces, hauling scrap metal. Tasks that left his hands blistered and his clothes soaked in sweat. Hank never said much, but his eyes carried a warning. "Stay in your place." Marcus kept his head down. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here for the paycheck, for his mother and little sister back in Chicago. But the weight of their disdain pressed harder each day. In the break room, men like Tommy Callahan, a wiry welder with a sharp tongue, would toss barbs disguised as jokes. "Hey Marcus, you ever get tired of shining shoes?" he'd say, grinning as the others laughed. Marcus would clench his jaw, sip his coffee, and say nothing. Silence was his shield, though it did little to dull the sting. The factory floor was its own world, a maze of grinding machines and hissing pipes. Marcus worked the rolling mill, where steel bars were shaped into beams. It was dangerous work. One wrong move could mean a crushed limb or worse. He'd trained himself to stay sharp, memorizing every lever, every gauge. His father, a mechanic, had taught him to respect machines, to understand their rhythms. "They don't care about your skin," his father used to say. "They only care if you're smart enough to keep up." Marcus was smart, smarter than most of the men who mocked him. But they didn't see that. They saw his dark skin, his quiet demeanor, and labeled him less. One muggy afternoon in July, the air thick with the smell of oil and metal, Tommy and his crew took it further. Marcus was hauling a crate of tools when Tommy accidentally bumped into him, sending the crate crashing to the floor. Wrenches and bolts scattered, drawing laughs from the others. "Clumsy, ain't ya?" Tommy said, his eyes gleaming with malice. Marcus knelt to gather the tools, his face burning. He could feel their stares, hear their snickers. Hank walked by, glanced at the mess, and muttered, "Clean it up, Reed. Don't hold up the line." No one helped. No one ever did. That night, Marcus sat in his rented room on the East Side, staring at the cracked ceiling. He thought about quitting, about going back to Chicago, but the thought of his sister's face, her dreams of college, kept him tethered. He wasn't just working for himself. He couldn't afford to break. The next day, the factory was busier than usual. A big order had come in, and the rolling mill was running at full capacity. The air vibrated with the screech of metal on metal, the heat so intense it felt like the room was breathing fire. Marcus worked his station, adjusting the rollers with precision, his hands steady despite the chaos. Tommy's crew was nearby, shouting over the noise. their voices laced with the usual taunts. "Don't break the machine, boy," one of them called. Marcus ignored them, focusing on the rhythm of the steel. Then it happened. A piercing screech cut through the din, followed by a sickening groan from the main furnace. The conveyor belt shuddered to a halt, and a red glow pulsed from the furnace's mouth. Someone yelled, "Overload!" The gauges were spiking, pressure building too fast. If the furnace wasn't shut down properly, it could blow, sending molten steel and shrapnel across the floor. Men froze, their faces pale. Hank was nowhere in sight. He'd stepped out for a smoke. Panic spread like wildfire. Workers backed away, some running for the exits. Tommy, usually so cocky, stood rooted, his eyes wide as he stared at the furnace. He'd been working the feeder line, and a steel rod he'd loaded was jammed, causing the backup. I didn't mean," he stammered, but no one was listening. Marcus didn't hesitate. He'd seen this before, back in Chicago, when his father had walked him through a similar malfunction at a smaller plant. "Stay calm," his father's voice echoed in his mind. "Machines don't panic. You shouldn't either." Marcus grabbed a pair of thermal gloves from a nearby station and sprinted toward the furnace. The heat was unbearable, like standing inside an oven. He could hear shouts behind him. "What's he doing? He's gonna get himself killed!" But he tuned them out. The control panel was a mess of flashing lights and screaming alarms. Marcus scanned the gauges, his mind racing. The pressure was critical, but the manual override could still work if he could free the jammed rod. He grabbed a pry bar and climbed onto the platform near the furnace's feeder. The heat seared his skin, even through the gloves, and the air was so thick he could barely breathe. The rod was lodged deep, bent at an angle that threatened to rupture the feeder entirely. "Get back, Reed!" someone yelled, but Marcus didn't look up. He wedged the pry bar into the gap, leveraging his weight against the rod. His muscles strained, sweat pouring down his face. The metal groaned, resisting, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. If the furnace blew, it wouldn't just be his life at stake. With a final heave, the rod shifted, then popped free. Marcus stumbled back, nearly falling, as the conveyor lurched back to life. He scrambled to the control panel, his hands flying over the levers. He adjusted the pressure valves, rerouting the molten steel to a secondary channel. The gauges began to stabilize, the red glow fading. The alarms fell silent. For a moment, the factory was eerily quiet. Then the murmurs started. Workers crept back, their faces a mix of shock and relief. Marcus stood by the panel, catching his breath, his clothes soaked and his hands trembling. He glanced at Tommy, who was still standing where he'd been when the crisis began, his face ashen. Hank burst through the door, his scowl replaced by confusion. "What the hell happened?" he demanded. One of the older workers, a man named Joe, who'd never spoken to Marcus before, stepped forward. "Reed saved our asses, that's what. Furnace was gonna blow, and he fixed it." Hank's eyes narrowed, flicking to Marcus. "You did this?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Marcus nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Had to. Didn't want anyone getting hurt." The foreman stared at him, then at the furnace, now humming steadily. He didn't say anything else, just gave a curt nod and turned away. But the others were different. Joe clapped Marcus on the shoulder, a gesture that felt foreign after months of isolation. "Good work, kid," he said gruffly. Others muttered similar things, their voices low, as if embarrassed by their own words. Tommy, though, stayed silent. His eyes met Marcus's for a moment, then darted away. Marcus saw something there. Guilt, maybe, or shame. He didn't care. He'd done what he had to do, not for Tommy, not for any of them, but because it was right. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. Word of the incident spread, and by the next day, the factory buzzed with a different kind of energy. Men who'd never spoken to Marcus nodded as he passed. Some even offered small talk. Awkward, but genuine. "Heard you pulled some hero shit," one said, almost shyly. Marcus just shrugged. He wasn't here for praise either. But the change wasn't universal. Tommy and his crew kept their distance, their taunts replaced by sullen glares. Marcus knew better than to expect apologies. Men like Tommy didn't bend easily, especially not to someone they'd spent months trying to break. Still, their silence was a small victory. Even Hank seemed to ease up, assigning Marcus to the main line instead of the grunt work. It wasn't respect, not yet, but it was a start. Weeks passed, and the factory settled into a new rhythm. Marcus still felt the weight of being the outsider, but it was lighter now. He'd proven something, not just to them, but to himself. He could endure. He could rise above. One evening, as he walked home through the east side, the sky streaked with orange from the setting sun, he felt a quiet pride. He wasn't invisible anymore, not to them, and not to himself. Back in Chicago, he wrote to his mother, enclosing his latest paycheck. In the letter, he didn't mention the furnace or the men who'd mocked him. He wrote about the future, his sister's college fund, the house they'd buy one day. He wrote about hope, because for the first time in months, he felt it. The factory would never be home. Milltown would never fully accept him. But Marcus Reed was no longer just the stranger on the floor. He was the man who'd faced the fire and walked away unbroken, and that was enough.